In Chapter 9, we look at growth and metabolism of microbes. Basically, what are the things that they need to grow? When we look at, in general, what they need, all cells need certain physical and chemical requirements to survive and then to grow. And what does it mean to grow? When we're looking at microbes like bacteria, we're talking about multiplying. So if one cell multiplies into two, basically surviving, you have to stay alive in order to be able to reproduce. And that's kind of what we consider to be fitness when it comes to any type of life. And so all cells have similar needs. Some are going to be a little bit different and some are going to be pretty extreme. But basically they're all going to have sort of these same categories of what they need. And so when we look at some of these cells that are adapted to these extreme conditions, you can kind of see some of the listings here. These are sort of the ones we're not going to talk about a whole lot, but it is kind of crazy to see that they can live so far underground. They can live in really warm environments, really cold environments. Most of what you find here you'll see are bacteria and archaea as well, so your prokaryotes. So as far as what microbes need, the physical and chemical factors that we'll be exploring here, water and temperature. So all cells need water, but temperature meaning what sort of temperature do they grow best at and what can they survive in. There will be ranges there as well. With organic molecules, we'll be looking at carbohydrates, proteins, and lipids, just kind of mentioning them, but that's what organisms need for fuel. And then oxygen, if they need oxygen, some organisms do not, and the pH, so what type of acidic or basic environment are they living in? And then we'll explore some other factors as well. If you kind of look here at a bacterial cell as far as what it's made up of, you can see it's mostly made up of water, so that's very important. The organic compounds, again, carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, and then also nucleic acids. We don't really use those for energy as much, but that's DNA and RNA, so the cell's going to have that. Also then you can see there are some different ions and smaller molecules as well. And again, our cells are going to have similar requirements to something like a bacterial cell would have as well. So when we talk about metabolism, we're talking about all the chemical reactions that are going on in the cell, or if we're talking about a larger organism, then we would talk about an organism. But we can kind of look at it at the cellular level. It's a little bit easier to kind of think about. So there are different physical factors, and again, water. You can see that all cells need water, and some can get by with a lot less water, but they definitely need water to survive and to be able to then multiply as well. And so temperatures, a lot of organisms have different ranges of temperatures, and you can see some categories listed here. Psychrophiles, those have a pretty cool range of temperatures. Psychrotrophs is just a little bit warmer, and we specifically use this terminology to describe organisms that like to grow in the refrigerator, which is important when it comes to food spoilage. Most that we probably deal with, most bacteria at least, and eukaryotes are mesophiles, meaning like kind of those medium temperatures as well. Thermophiles would like warmer temperatures, and hyperthermophiles. When you look at the graphs here, the peak of each line would be the optimal temperature. But then if you look at the range, that means like a psychrophile may be able to grow at something close to -10 degrees Celsius. It's probably not going to grow very well, but you may have a few that are able to survive and multiply, and then even going on the other extreme range. But in the case of those, most of them prefer an average of about 12 or 13 degrees Celsius. Every species is going to be a little bit different, but we just classify them based on these temperature needs. So a lot of it's a bit of an average as well. All right, oxygen needs. So we can break down we do this a lot when we look at bacteria, but breaking them down into aerobes, anaerobes, and then what we call facultative anaerobes. There are a few more divisions, but we'll just focus on these three. And so something that is an aerobe requires oxygen. It has to have oxygen in order to be able to survive and reproduce. Anaerobes, there are cells out there that do not like oxygen at all, and so sometimes we call them obligate aerobes and obligate anaerobes. But if they are exposed to oxygen, then they will not survive. A lot of times what most organisms are called facultative, and sometimes they're called facultative anaerobes, meaning that they can adapt to be anaerobic, they can survive without oxygen, but they really would grow best in the presence of oxygen. And even if you think about our cells are capable, we need oxygen, but we can perform a little bit without having enough oxygen supply. We just can't keep that up forever. And so we can relate this to microbes as well. And so also pH levels, another way to classify organisms. Most organisms are probably going to be neutrophiles, and so we have a pH of 5 to 8. 7 is what's considered to be exactly neutral. Acidophiles are going to like a lower pH, and if you want to kind of think of about 3 as a good example, that always works for me. And then some of those extreme can even live in a pH of 1 or 2. For instance, there's a bacteria called Helicobacter pylori, and it lives in the stomach lining. While stomachs usually have a pH of about 1 as far as stomach acid, because it's important to break down food and digest food. And so there are some bacteria that thrive in those conditions, and if they multiply too much, then a lot of times they may cause ulcers. And so this was kind of a new discovery several years ago, but they used to think that ulcers were only caused by stress, but then they realized that sometimes people who were more susceptible to ulcers had more of this H. pylori in their stomach lining. All right, alkalophiles, I believe I have a little typo there in spelling, sorry. But they live in a higher pH, and so you can think of about an 11 to kind of categorize that. So meaning that they can survive, and they may not survive in pHs that are outside of their ranges. Sometimes most species have a preference of about a 1% salt concentration, and so our cells are indeed like that. A lot of bacterial cells are like that. But there are some organisms that can survive in even more intense salt concentrations. And so if that's the case, you're going to see, if you've seen this picture here, in the Great Salt Lake in Utah, there are some bacteria that actually like these conditions and can grow and flourish in these conditions as well. And they just happen to kind of let off this pink color, so it's kind of cool to look at there as well. Some bacteria like Staph aureus that can actually survive in a little higher salt concentration, maybe a 7% salt concentration, so that gives them an advantage there as well. But there's definitely a preference of salt that they can handle. Pressure. Organisms all need a little bit of pressure, but not too much pressure. There are some that we would call barophiles. That would be a pretty extreme condition, living 6 miles below the Earth's surface. And then we can also look at radiation. So radiation, there are different levels of wavelengths, and most radiations, when they have this small wavelength, they are able to kill damage DNA and maybe destroy DNA. So because of this, they kill most species. Some can be resistant to this and have adapted a little bit better for that. So those are some basic physical needs, and now in order to look at chemical needs, we need to think about metabolism a little bit. As I mentioned, those are the sum of all the reactions going on in a cell. We can also break this down into anabolism and catabolism. Anabolism is building of molecules, and catabolism is breaking down of molecules, sometimes called biosynthesis and then digestion. And so in order to do this, in order to have these reactions going on inside the cell, energy is needed, eventually in the form of ATP. A lot of enzymes are needed in order to facilitate these reactions and speed up these reactions. And then these organic molecules, macromolecules, are needed: carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, and water, also nucleic acids as well. And then inorganic molecules like vitamins and minerals. These are required in smaller amounts, but certainly are important. And so first of all, looking at enzymes. Enzymes are very important because there are just so many enzymes that react in one single cell even. And so enzymes are mostly proteins. They are highly specific. This means that you only have certain enzymes that are going to work on certain products. And we talk about a substrate. The substrate is the molecule that we're beginning with, and then the products is what we're ending up with. And so the substrate actually binds to the enzyme at what's called an active site, and because it does that, then this reaction occurs. The good news is once the reaction is done, they are reusable. So the enzyme changes shape while it's actually forming the products, but then it goes back to its original shape to be able to be used again. It can't be used over and over and over indefinitely, but certainly many, many times. So we don't have to keep, cells don't have to keep making those over and over. They're fast and pretty efficient, so they don't need a lot of them. But again, there's a lot of different ones inside the cell, so they're definitely very important. This figure is a good one to look at if you want to look at the action of an enzyme. And so here, if you look at the top, we have a substrate, and that substrate is a sugar called sucrose. That's actually a disaccharide, so two sugar molecules put together. And so when that sucrose is in a cell, it needs to be broken down so that we can get energy from those products. And so there's the enzyme that binds the sucrose. And so you can see here, once it's bound, we call it the enzyme substrate complex. When it's bound, then the enzyme changes shape and performs an action here, and actually is breaking these two molecules apart. And so the end product is we have now two monosaccharides, glucose and fructose. The reason we need monosaccharides is because when we're dealing with cells getting energy, these are going to be able to get into the cell and be able to be used easier than something that is a larger molecule as well. And most cells use glucose most readily, and so kind of keep in mind that that's a carbohydrate. We'll be focusing on that one the most. So as far as energy goes, we're talking about energy in the form of ATP, and so we have chemical energy. When we take these organic molecules into a cell, or bacteria takes them into a cell, they need to be broken down and converted into ATP, adenosine triphosphate. And so basically ATP is made up of three kind of different molecules here, adenine and ribose, and then these three phosphate groups. So the triphosphate represents three phosphates. Sometimes this is shown kind of as a PO4 each. Here's 1, 2, and 3. And other times it's just kind of abbreviated as a P. And so it's important to see this ATP molecule. When it has the three phosphate bonds, we know it's ATP. When there is a breakdown and one of these phosphate bonds is released, now we have ADP because the phosphate is not attached anymore. This is important because this is where energy is released. And a lot of times we'll see kind of this bolt, kind of a lightning bolt here, looking as far as energy being released. In order to put this molecule back together, it requires energy to be put into the equation because putting something back together is harder. And so ATP is constantly getting cycled between ATP breaking down to ADP plus the phosphate group. You can kind of think of this phosphate group as a high bundle of energy because it's going to transfer energy to something else. And so the cells are going to need to use ATP in order to facilitate this transfer. So the breakdown of these molecules is called cellular respiration. It's kind of a tough concept to talk about. I'm going to do it in kind of a short fashion, hopefully giving you what you need, just kind of the basics here. But it is a little complicated, so while it may seem a little overwhelming, I just want you to know and understand sort of the basics of it, and I will do that in part 2.